So if you don't mind, just to take this workbook for a second, as we go along, I'll tell you which these are all the words and terms that are related to the subject of Mashiach. And as we go along, we'll check it off. So you become familiar with the language. So far, the one thing which we came across in the Rambam is number 5. Kibbutz Golius. Anyone know what that is? Kibbutz Golius? Kibbutz means ingathering. Golius means the exiles. In other words, this is one of the things Moshiach will accomplish, bringing together all the Jews from all over the world to Eretz Yisrael. So again, this is a term that's used often. One of the words related to the subject of Mashiach, Kibbutz Golius. Okay, let's continue now with the actual book. That's the workbook. Do you all have the books itself? This is the workbook, not the actual book. Yeah. Is it on the table? Is it there?
One was here.
What? This one is. Oh, wait a second. Yeah. We'll make more. So on page 9, we're in the Rambam and we're in halacha number 3. Up until now, we spoke about the general belief in Mashiach, what the belief is, where is the source, and now we're going into more of the details. We have to understand that the subject of Mashiach is no different than any subject of Torah and any subject of Judaism that we need. Oh, there's more workbooks if anyone else needs it. That we need to follow what it says in Torah to determine whether it's right or wrong, whether it's kosher or not kosher. Which means just like with food, we look in the Torah to see, is this food kosher? Is this permissible on Shabbos? Here too, if someone will say, oh, this is Mashiach, we need the Torah and look into Torah to know what is it that defines Mashiach in the Torah way and what is not. So here's where the Rambam begins. First he starts with what it's not. Al yala al daitcha, one should not presume, it shouldn't even enter your mind that Melech HaMashiach must work miracles and wonders, bring about new creations within the world, resurrect the dead, or perform other similar deeds. This is definitely not true. We just finished learning the other day that one of the 13 principles of belief is that Mashiach will bring the dead back to life. And here he's saying it shouldn't even dawn upon you that Mashiach will perform miracles and bring the dead back to life. It's definitely not true. That doesn't make any sense. So what is the Rambam saying? Well, very clearly, he's not saying that he's not going to do these things. We're now talking about a different subject. We're talking about the subject, how do I identify that the person, obviously one day, someone will come along and say that I am Moshiach, I've been designated by Hashem to take the Jewish people out of exile and bring you all to Israel. And we need to know, is this authentic or it's not authentic? Is it true or not true? So one would think, first of all, let's see if he can perform miracles. If he perform miracles, oh, that means he's a miraculous, godly person. Not. Now the Rambam is not saying this only because miracles will be more convincing. He's saying it because this is actually what happened with the Jews in Egypt. If you don't mind, Yocheved, I want to pass this around. But a lot of the details about Mashiach are very similar to what happened when the Jews went out of Egypt. Not only because they're similar, it's the same idea, but it's also based on a pasuk. There's a pasuk where it says, and just like you went out of Egypt, that's how in the future you'll be going out of this exile. And the commentary on that pasuk is, it's not only that just like that was redemption, this is redemption. But it means that in many ways and in many details, the redemption through Moshiach will reflect a lot of the things that happened when we went out of Mitzrayim. One of the things that happened when out of Mitzrayim was also Moshe Rabbeinu was the so-called Moshiach of that generation. He was the Redeemer. How did he know that he's the Redeemer? The story is in the Chumash. You know the story. He was a shepherd and he had sheep, and a little lamb ran away from the flock, and he ran after it. He chased after it. Then he came across a burning bush, and he saw something which was unnatural. The bush was on fire, but it wasn't being consumed. As he went closer, he heard Hashem's voice. Hashem said to him, "You're standing in holy soil. Take off your shoes." Then Hashem said to him, "I'm appointing you to be the person to take the Yidden out of Mitzrayim." It's in the Chumash. Then he said to him, "What if the Yidden won't believe me?" So Hashem said, "Let me tell you something. I'll give you a certain miracle to perform, and that'll be convincing. If that doesn't convince them, I'll give you a second miracle. If that doesn't convince them, I'll give you a third miracle. By then, they'll be convinced." So I just want to show it to you inside the Chumash. We can just read the Chumash. I'll read it in English, but as we go along, I want to point this out. Moshe answered to Hashem, "Behold, they will not believe me, and they will not heed my voice. They will say, the Lord did not appear to you." You can imagine, Jews are in Geulah for 210 years, suffering. By that time, they lost all hope that they'll ever get out of this Geulah. Someone comes along and says, "Hashem spoke to me, and he told me to take you out," and they're going to say, "Why should I believe you?" So Hashem said to him, "What is in your hand?" So he said, "A staff, stick." Hashem said, "Throw it to the ground." He threw it to the ground, and it became a serpent. In fact, it was so frightening, Moshe ran away from it. So Hashem said to Moshe, "Stretch out your hand, take hold of its tail," and as soon as he grabbed it, the serpent became a stick again. And this is being done so they should believe you that the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob sent you. Then Hashem said further, "Now I'll give you another thing to perform. Put your hands turn the page, into your bosom." And he put his hand into his bosom and he took it out, and behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Leprous is mitzorah, and the color, it's not a color, it's white. Then he said, "Put your hands back," and he put it back and then took it out again, and it was again just like the rest of the flesh, just like before. And then I said, "And one of these two things they still won't believe you, that they'll believe you if you do the third sign. If they not believe you with these two signs, and they don't heed your voice, you shall take the water of the Nile, spill it on the dry land, and the water that you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry land." So clearly, Hashem said to him, "I'm going to give you 3 miracles to perform to show them that you are authentic." So I would think that's the basis, that the same would be with Mashiach. Someone will come, he'll do things which are supernatural, that he will say that Hashem told me to do this, so that you'll be convinced that he's really being sent by Hashem. There's only Hashem to do that. And then will be, so Rambam says, no, don't even think that he has to do miracles. Don't think that he has to resurrect the dead. Doesn't mean he won't. In the future he will. But he doesn't need to do these miracles to prove his identity that we should accept it. That's what it means. Is this clear? I want to give you another example where we find that something has to be proven before we can accept. The other example is a Navi. One of the 613 commandments is that you must listen to a prophet. Now, how do I know he's a prophet? Someone comes along and goes, hello, my name is Yankel the prophet. And Hashem told me to tell you to do this and this. There must be a Torah procedure. How do we know that he's authentic? So the Rambam writes, he's the one who writes the laws of prophecy, and he says, yes, there is a procedure. The court of rabbis will tell them to prophesy something about the future. And then we'll wait to see if it actually happens precisely the way he prophesied. If it does, then we tell him to do it again, or a third time. It doesn't say exactly how many times, but a number of times. And by the way, this is providing that we already know that this person is tzaddik. Prophecy is not a trick. It only comes to people who are perfect tzaddikim. So we have to know that he's a Torah scholar, that he observes mitzvahs meticulously, and he's a righteous person, doesn't do any sin, not in thought, not in speech, not in action, and spiritually he lives a perfect life. And then, still doesn't mean he's a prophet. He could be a very big tzaddik, but not necessarily a prophet. So if, on top of that, he says he's a prophet, and he prophesies something about the future, one time, a second time, a third time, or a fourth time, and it's fulfilled accurately, and he's proven that Hashem sent him. Yes? So really you're going into another question, and that is that if you look at the Torah, it pretty much appears that they all sinned. Moshe Rabbeinu also sinned. He was punished. He couldn't go into the land of Israel. Now is not the time and the place to go into it, but we will eventually. If anyone really won't be able to sleep at night, I'll be happy to sit in the office and explain it to you. But when it says in the Torah that they sinned, 1 second, it doesn't mean sin in the literal sense that we understand sin. It means something happened, which according to their standards, that Hashem demands of them, it was something which was also not that they went against Hashem's will, but something was lacking, and that's the result. But Moshe did not sin, and Miriam did not sin, and Aaron did, especially if you study Tanya, and you realize that not even Moshe, even a Beinanim, which are people amongst us, could be Beinanim. A Beinanim is a person that never sins. So how could someone like Miriam or Moshe, or even Abraham, it says Abraham was doubting Hashem's promise, right? You know that story. So we even find with Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, that there's certain things that on the surface, it appears as if they sinned, but really it's something much deeper to it. And Lina, then we'll have the time to explain it. Yeah. So when it says a tzaddik falls 7 times, does that mean that he sinned 7 times? If he would be sinning, he wouldn't be a tzaddik. According to Alter Rebbe, even a person who sins once is already not even a Beinanim. Then it's called a Rasha B'Rabbi. So the idea of falling is not, again, it's not the way we understand it simply. I wish I could give all the classes in one class and that would be done, but it takes time. We need some basic information first. No, it says Yaakov was afraid of Esau, and Rashi says, why was he afraid? From the Gemara, he was afraid maybe because I sinned, I don't deserve to get Hashem's protection. Again, Yaakov, Abraham, Yitzhak, they were not perfect tzaddikim. They were perfect tzaddikim in a way that we can't even comprehend. And there's no question that they didn't sin. So it's a deeper meaning to those words. And there's also a deeper meaning to the words where it says there's no such thing as a tzaddik that doesn't sin. Again, if it would mean literally sin, And whatever it says in Tanya is no longer valid. So it has to mean something deeper. Okay, so we see that a Navi, in order for us to accept that he's a Navi, a prophet, he has to prophesy once, a few times, and then that'll prove, again, doing something miraculous. He's telling us something about the future. So now we know that he must be a Navi. So I would think Moshiach has to do something which is a little bit out of the ordinary, especially Moshiach. He's supposed to be the most phenomenal tzaddik, most phenomenal prophet, most phenomenal leader and king. He surely has to do something out of the norm, something completely out of the ordinary to prove that he's that. The Rambam says no, he doesn't have to do anything that's supernatural to prove his identity. That's not what it depends on. Ein adova kach. This is not the case. And now he brings proof that this is not the case. This is the Rambam's proof. Proof may be brought from the fact that Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest sages of the Mishnah, was one of the supporters of King Bar Koziba, and would describe him as the Messianic king. Not only he and all the sages of his generation considered him to be the Melech HaMashiach until he was killed. He was killed by the Romans because of sins. Once he was killed, they realized that he was not Mashiach. And in that case, we find that the sages did not ask him for any signs or wonders. So this is a story in the Gemara that talks about what happened after the Romans destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. So they destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, the Jews were in exile. A certain individual, apparently he was a tzaddik, he was a leader, he was a warrior, and his name was Ben Koziba. So if just before we lose track, if you can refer back to your workbooks 1 second, if you could look at number 16 and 17. This person had two names. One name is Ben Koziba, that's 16. He's also known by another name, Bar Kochba. Ben Koziba was his actual name. Bar Kochba was some sort of a nickname. And why do they call him Bar Kochba? Bar Kochba is in Aramaic. By the way, just for the future, if you look at a word and you want to recognize, is this a Hebrew word or is it Aramaic? One of the ways to recognize that is what's the last letter in the word. If it's a Hey, it's usually Hebrew. If it's an Aleph, it's usually Aramaic. So Bar Kochba is Aramaic, and Koziba is Aramaic. What does Bar Kochba mean? If you remember, the other class we learned that the Rambam wrote the verse, and a star will come out of Jacob. And the Gemara says, this is alluding to Moshiach. Just like a star is a shining star, Moshiach will be a shining star. So they called him Bar Kochba. In Aramaic, it's like the Hebrew word Kochav, which means a star. Okay, back to the text. So what's the story with Bar Kochba? At one point, he gathered soldiers. He himself was a very mighty person, very physically very strong. The soldiers that he gathered together were also very strong. I think it says that in order to join his army, you had to be able to ride on a horse and stick out your thumb, if I remember correctly, and with your thumb uproot a tree. If you can do that, you can join his army. He gathered together very strong people, and he began to fight the Romans. And he conquered city after city after city. I think it says he conquered altogether about 60 cities back from the Romans and took it over. At that point, Rabbi Akiva, who was probably the leader of Jewry at that time, like the Rambam writes, he is one of the greatest sages of the Mishnah. In fact, there's another quote somewhere that says, the entire oral Torah is based on his teachings, Rabbi Akiva. And not only he, but all the sages that were at that time said this person is Moshiach. Basically, he's going to defeat the Romans and he's going to take us out of Geulah and rebuild the third Beis HaMikdash. He had the signs because he was doing all these things. But the Rambam writes, Hakam doesn't say that they asked him to perform a miracle, which means they assumed that they accepted that he is Mashiach without asking him to prophesies the future, not asking him to do a miracle. So we see from this that Mashiach does not have to do anything which is supernatural, and nevertheless, there's criteria which is different criteria that's the basis for accepting him as Mashiach. Yeah.
But he wasn't Mashiach. So why can't we say that he thought he wasn't?
So we're soon going to learn that he was, but it didn't come to fruition. That's in fact the main point the Rambam wants to bring out. That there's such a possibility. So how do they know that he wasn't? Once he was killed by the Romans, he was defeated by his enemies. We'll see later that this is one of the criteria, that he has to be able to be victorious over his enemies. And if his enemies defeat him, that's a sign that he's not Mashiach. And then they knew that he is not the person who's Mashiach. So we see from this that it's not necessary, it's not a criteria that he must perform miracles. Because I think this is what most people imagine when they think of Mashiach, that someone's going to come and do something like really super duper natural. And it could happen, by the way. Rambam doesn't say it can't happen that way. He's just saying it's not necessary for him to perform miracles. Even if he does things in a way which are totally the natural order, there's really a different criteria how we can establish that his identity is the true identity. He's a Mashiach. Now, one of the reasons why this is so important, of course, is because if you know anything about Jewish history with this regarding this subject, there were quite a few times where there were Jews who declared themselves as Mashiach. They were what we call false Mashiach, and they misled people and caused a lot of destruction. In fact, in a sense, that's what Christianity is about. It was also a Jew, and people looked at him as he's Mashiach, and he changed the Torah and everything else. We'll talk about that soon. The Rambam actually addresses this subject. So therefore, it's very important to know, according to Torah, how do we define Mashiach in an authentic way? So the Rambam says, first of all, what it's not. Next page, the main thrust of this matter is the Torah, its statutes and its laws are everlasting. We may not add to them or subtract from them. How does that fit into the picture? Because this is like the principle of all principles. In fact, every single person who ever declared himself as a false Mashiach, that's what they did. They tried to change and alter the Torah. Christianity, of course, but take the two things, which is Christianity and Islam, both of them changed the Torah, each one in a different way. Both of them claim that they're the Mashiach, but on that basis, they changed the Torah. Later, there were other Jews. There was someone called Shabtai Tzvi. There was someone called Frank. They also made changes in Torah, and they made such changes until they themselves converted to another religion. So they were way off. But initially, they attracted people to follow them. And Rambam says one thing is Torah will never be changed. And anyone who comes along and says the Torah is changing, there you know right away this is false, this is not Torah. So what is the criteria? So the Rambam lists 4 things. And he's also going to introduce that there are 2 stages in Mashiach's arrival. What are the 4 things? Here it starts. Number 1, if a king will arise from the house of King David, who is a learned in Torah and observance of mitzvahs. So the first thing is, it has to be a tzaddik. He has to be steeped in Torah study, observe mitzvahs meticulously. Like I said before, that he has to be a tzaddik of the highest order to be worthy to be this person's Mashiach. But the first criteria is that he is the Beis David from the house of King David. He's a descendant of King David. You might remember the first 2 classes we gave when we went through the pages of Tanakh, In a number of places, it said that a sprout something will sprout from the house of King David, and many other sources where it consistently says that this person is going to take us out of Geulah, and he's a descendant of King David. In fact, the first page of the Rambam was that Moshiach will reestablish and reinstate the kingdom, the Davidic dynasty of King David. He has to be a descendant of King David. Most people ask a question, how in the world do we know today, without a miracle, that someone is a descendant of King David? He lived, how many years ago? He lived close to 2,500 years ago, a little bit more than 2,500 years ago. How could you today prove that you're a descendant of King David? When the time comes, we'll see how we'll prove it. But generally speaking, there's also something very simple. And that is, there are a lot of great Torah scholars that testified on themselves and wrote this in their commentary on their books, that they are descendants of King David. Some of them lived a few hundred years ago. Some of them lived even later. And it's not that difficult to know that I'm a descendant of someone who lived, a few generations ago. And if that person is a descendant of King David, then we know that the person living today is a descendant of King David. So, for example, Rashi is one of the people that was a descendant of King David. I did a little research. I finally found someone who printed a book about the Maharal of Prague. I've never heard that name. Maharal of Prague, he lived obviously in Prague, that's a city in Europe. And his name was Rabbi Geulah. And he was a direct descendant of King David. So this person did the research. How do we know, and where do we see that he's a direct? He went to the research, and he has the exact lineage, father and son, from King David until the Maharal of Prague, showing how he's a descendant of King David. This is it's not going to help you, so I'm just showing you. But this is the name, all the names of the generations. Now, a lot of it is in the Torah itself. You don't have to work so hard. In the Torah itself, it says, which son of Yaakov did King David come from? What? Yehuda. King David was a descendant of Yehuda. He belonged to the tribe of Yehuda. In the Torah, it says exactly, Yehuda had this son. This son had another son. His name was such and such. He had another son named such and such. And then it says that he was King David. Also, one of the books you'll be learning here in school is the book of Ruth. So the story with Ruth is that she was a descendant. She married Boaz. She was a convert, but she married Boaz, and she had a son, and his grandson was the father of King David, and that's where King David comes from. And Boaz, it says in the book of Ruth, how he was a descendant of King David. So now we know how, not King David, sorry, he was a descendant of Yehuda, from that son, which is supposed to be the source of Moshiach. Okay, and then from King David, in the books of the prophets, very often it has names of father and son. So a lot of the names are in the books of the prophets. And then there's also the other books of great sages, Rabbi Haigaon, Rashi, Rambam, Arizal. These are all people that we knew their lineage. Arizal lived for only 400 years ago. Rambam was 800 years ago. And people know that they are descendants of these people. And we know that's easy to know. For example, the Alter Rebbe was a descendant of the Maharal of Prague that I just mentioned. We know the Alter Rebbe's father's name, his grandfather's name, his great-grandfather's name, and exactly how he was a descendant. And then we know that someone today is a descendant from the Alter Rebbe, which there are thousands of people that are descendants of the Alter Rebbe. So anyone who's a descendant of the Alter Rebbe is automatically a descendant of King David. Because Alter Rebbe is a descendant of Maharal of Prague, and the Maharal of Prague is a descendant of King David. So therefore, it's not such a difficult thing to know. That means if you have someone who is a dynamic leader, a brilliant Torah scholar, all the qualities of a leader, but he's not a descendant of King David, he's not qualified to be Mashiach. On the other hand, if he's a descendant of King David, that doesn't mean he's Mashiach. He still has to have the other conditions. So again, the first thing is that he has to be a tzaddik, that he studies Torah, observes the mitzvahs as prescribed in the written Torah and the oral Torah, like David, his ancestor, was. And of course, the Rambam emphasizes that during the Rambam's lifetime, there was a movement called Karayim. Karayim is a movement of Jews who believe in the written Torah, but they do not believe and do not follow the oral Torah. Maybe we heard a little bit about them. But for example, the Torah says that on Shabbos you should sit in your house. So our sages in the oral Torah say they have the oral Torah which is passed down from Moshe Rabbeinu. Doesn't mean you have to sit in your house on Shabbos. It means you're not allowed to walk more than X amount of not miles. I don't know what numbers it would be, but there's 2,000 amos in the Hebrew language that you're not allowed to go past that out of your city. But these people don't walk out of their house on Shabbos. Because in the Chumash it says you sit in your house. It means literally sit in the house. Tefillin, it says in the Chumash, and the tefillin on your head should be between your eyes. I'm sure you've seen men who wear tefillin. They put it on the head over here between the eyes. They put it over here. Tefillin is sticking out from here. It says between the eyes. So this movement was established and originated during the second Beis Hamikdash. Surprise. Such a holy time. And in fact, it was so bad, there was a time during Hanukkah time, if you know the history, most Jews were following this movement. It was a very scary time. Eventually, it all sort of faded away, but then it got revived again. And in the times of the Rambam was a very strong movement, Karoyim. And the Rambam was one of the very fierce opponents and fighting that people should not follow that movement. That's why he says, he has to be someone who follows Torah, the written Torah and the oral Torah, not Chas v'Shalom, not the Torah in a complete way. He will compel all of Israel to walk in the ways of Torah and reinforce the breaches in its observance. It basically means that he'll be engaged in bringing all the Jewish people back to Torah mitzvahs. And those who are already observing Torah mitzvahs should be sort of improving their observance. Two things. Number one is that those who are not should observe, and those that are should be strengthened. That's number three. What's number four? Number four is Yilcha Melchemes Hashem will fight the wars of Hashem. Just like we see with this person, Ben Kuziba, what he did was he fought the wars of Hashem. He fought the wars of Hashem, and unfortunately he didn't succeed. But if he fights the wars of Hashem and he does succeed, as we'll see later, but if he fights the wars of Hashem, what does fighting the wars of Hashem mean? So this, even in halacha, remember I told you halacha is not metaphor. Everything halacha is literal. But even literally in halacha, they still can have two meanings, and these terms are used in both ways. One way is the wars of Hashem, is like I just said, there were people like Karayim. These were movements who made an attempt to uproot Judaism. Let's say in Russia, the communist regime, there were Jews who were called Yevseksy, Jewish communists, that made an attempt to uproot Judaism. Or let's say a reform movement that made an attempt to uproot Torah authentic Judaism. To fight those movements and to prevent Jews from joining it, and to uphold Torah, and to see that Torah is being continued, not God forbid, getting lost, that's also a war. It's more of a spiritual war, but it's a war for Yiddishkeit. It's a war of Hashem, and Mashiach will be fighting that war, which would mean it's sort of the opposite of the first thing. The first thing was the positive. He will bring Yidden to observe Torah and observe mitzvahs. And he'll also fight the forces that try to prevent us from learning Torah and observing mitzvahs. The other interpretation is literally, he'll be engaged in actual physical war, which means like when Koziba, he got on a horse and he had a sword, and he was physically fighting a war. But then there's still more that we need to talk about, but this is first of all the four things that he says. Harezeh, if someone does these four things without performing miracles, you just know here's a person, and this person says that he was sent by Hashem to be Moshiach, and we say, A, he's a descendant of King David, or rather, I would say, A, that he's a tzaddik, get to it in a second. B, he's a descendant of King David. C, he's engaged in bringing Jews back to Yiddishkeit and strengthen Yiddishkeit. D, he's involved in fighting the wars of Hashem. We can assume that he is Mashiach based on that alone, because Rabbi Akiva did exactly that in the case of Baruch Hasiba. But we're not finished. We still got to wait for more things to happen. Yeah. I mean, could it be that we will approach someone and say, we want to appoint you as Mashiach? Yes, I think it's an interesting question. I don't remember seeing anywhere, but I would think, being that Moshiach is like any other prophet, which is appointed by Hashem, or like Moshe, so obviously he'd have to come to us and say to us, meaning to the rabbinical court, not in the marketplace to speak to Tom, Dick, and Harry. You can come to the Bezdin and say, Hashem sent me to the Jewish people out of Geulah, and they will do what needs to be done to see that he's authentic, I would think. But it's interesting, I'm just wondering, is it written anywhere that he has to say? Which means, what would be the other possibility? That we see someone who's a very big tzaddik, and we walk up and say, I think he should be Mashiach. No, I don't think that's the way it works. He has to be appointed by Hashem. Which means it'll be like a prophecy. Not like a prophecy, that is prophecy. Just like Moshe, Hashem came to him and said, I'm appointing you to take the Jinn out of Mitzrayim. Okay, then Rambam says there's another stage where it's still not finished. And these are two terms that are used, which will have to, this is one of the controversial issues, but this is the Rambam's innovation here, making it very clear that there are two stages. This person is called the Cheskas Mashiach, which means you can assume that he's Mashiach. Then he goes on, Im Osav Etzliach, which means if he continued and he succeeded in all these things we mentioned above, and beyond that, which means he succeeded in bringing Yidden closer to Yiddishkeit, he succeeded in bringing Yidden to observe Torah mitzvahs stronger, he succeeded in fighting the wars of Hashem against the enemies, and on top of that, Bona Mikdash b'Mekayma, he succeeded in building the Beis HaMikdash in its place, which means that it'll be built in the same spot where it was, because Hashem promised that this is the eternal place of the Beis HaMikdash. Which means if someone comes along and has all these signs and then builds a beautiful modern structure in Tel Aviv, that's not it. It has to be on the mountain, in the same spot where the original Beis HaMikdash stood, the first and the second, and that's what the third will be. That's why he adds the word in its place. Builds the temple in its place. Another thing, he succeeds in the way of bringing the dispersed of Israel back to Eretz Yisrael. If he succeeds in all that, Harezeh Mashiach Bada. So basically, if you want to underline, you can't underline it because you're not writing into this booklet, but you have two terms here. I'll show it to you in this booklet. And these are the Hebrew terms coming out of the Rambam. One is number 9, the other is number 11. 9-11. Okay, there you are. Now you know why 9-11. Okay. The first stage means if he does all those things, we can assume he's Mashiach, but it's still reversible. If we don't merit for one reason or other, then it can still change. The second one is, what if he went further? He actually brought all the Jews back to Israel. He built the Beis HaMikdash. He defeated his enemies. Could it still be reversible because of we don't merit? The Rambam says no. If that happens, if Hashem allows things to get that far, then you know this is it forever. It's irreversible. And these are the two stages. Number 9 means Becheskas Mashiach. Becheskas Mashiach means that we can assume that this person, like Rabbi Kiva, he actually announced and he declared openly, this person is Mashiach. We can say that. But that doesn't mean that it's not reversible. And that's exactly what happened. Because the Jewish people didn't merit, he ended up being killed, and the whole process was aborted. It stopped. But if someone comes along and he takes it further, that he actually succeeds in bringing all the Yidden back to Eretz Yisrael. He succeeds in actually building the Beis Hamikdash on the mountain where it's supposed to be standing, and he succeeds in defeating the enemies. Then that means he's Vadei Mashiach, which means it's an irreversible state. From this point on, there's no way of going back. So there are certain details here which are a lot of debates about them, which we'll have to go into. But in the meantime, this is the basis, and then we'll go into explaining it more. Number 9 and number 11. Okay, to be continued. I'll blow the shofar.